The apostles are those who stand at the top of the world, collectively known as the 12 supernatural beings. The story goes that each of the apostles, dressed in a blue cloak with a deep hood, was incredibly strong. Some could control water volumes comparable to the oceans. Others confronted entire human empires. Moreover, they could create new worlds from their own flesh and blood, cradling them in their arms like babies. Among them is the most powerful apostle named Yulman, who has unlimited power. According to records, his fighting power far surpasses that of other apostles, but its origin is unknown. The highest category of danger is designated as an apostle, but when the apostles themselves disappeared, they gradually began to be forgotten, remembered only in legends. A dark-haired guy dressed in a formal suit and cape sneezed loudly. Scratching his nose, he looked back at the icy mountains with snowcaps surrounding him and thought with displeasure that soldiers would come to this cold as soon as possible so as to eat this small dragon. Ice Dragon Warcraft, category Disaster. The most dangerous category in the existing classification of Warcraft has great destructive power. The brunette watched as the Ice Dragon led the various monsters of the north into the Thunderfield. In order to protect national security, the Empire of Guam immediately deployed its troops to defend. This battle will begin soon. The human warriors talked among themselves. Some asked whether their temporary detachment would be able to win. Others answered that only God knew the answer to this question. Finally, a cry was heard from a warrior at the front, which started the battle. The armored men, waving swords in one hand and holding shields in the other, rushed towards the army of monsters led by the Ice Dragon with a roar. Huge giants brought down the power of their fists on them. Raising his head and opening his mouth in surprise, the knight watched as birds of prey flew down on him from above with a deafening roar. The human army, like toy figures, flew away from the blows of the enemies. The dragon, with its red eyes flashing, crushed knights left and right with its sharp wings. The guy stood on a high slope and, seeing the squad running away in horror, muttered that these soldiers were not opponents of monsters. Thoughtfully putting his finger to his lips, he thought that the disparity in combat power was too great. Most likely, the humans would soon lose. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a red-haired stranger appeared on the battlefield, calling for no panic. The brunette looked around in surprise, hearing a girl's voice in the icy mountains. She continued her speech by saying that if the opponent is stronger, it does not mean that they are losing. Standing on the edge of the ice floe, she released a stream of fire straight from her palm upwards. If she retreated now, everything would definitely end in failure. Lowering her hand, the girl directed the fire straight towards the ice dragon. This fragile-looking stranger's name was Sierra Charlotte. One of the 4 great mages of the Guam Empire, known as the Fire Witch, was appointed to lead this army. The people came to life, joyfully exclaiming that now, thanks to Madame Sierra, they had a chance to win. Pointing her hand towards the monsters, Charlotte loudly gave the order to attack. With their fighting spirit raised, the knights rushed into the attack with renewed vigor. A snowstorm, immediately after the fiery stream, covered the dragon with a huge shaft. And when the snow settled, the predator's eyes narrowed dangerously. The dragon flapped its wings, roared and rose up, the people turned around in shock, and Sierra, who attacked it with the magic attack Fire Blast, could not believe that it was still moving. The animal released a large ice ball from its mouth, to then, the next second, spew ice and snow onto the human army, burying the warriors alive within themselves, killing them on the spot. The dragon flapped its wings, and the ice figures broke into several pieces right in the air. The Fire Witch, gritting her teeth, watched helplessly as her army perished. Unable to bear it any longer, she took a running start and jumped down, right into the thick of things. Raising her fiery sword above herself, Sierra shouted that she, as a mage of the Guam Empire, would not allow the dragon to win. The monster turned towards the sound, its eyes flashing with rage. The girl's sword landed with a clang on the dragon's icy tail. Their gazes, full of fury, stared at each other. Each one, calling upon magic, attacked the enemy with his weapon. But they were unable to touch each other. Charlotte jumped up, saving herself from the ice attack. The girl landed confidently on the cold ground. She formed a circle of fire around herself, from which flaming arrows separated, ready to fly at the ice monster at any second. He, without wasting any time, released from within another frosty, deadly portion of the blizzard. The witch rushed forward with a furious cry, followed by her faithful arrows. The dragon opened its fanged mouth and spewed out a magical ice ball. All that was left was to watch as ice and fire rushed towards each other. The two elements clashed in battle with a deafening sound. But the dragon's power turned out to be many times stronger, and the ice floe broke the fiery circle. Sierra squealed, realizing she was trapped. The ice extinguished the flame in a matter of seconds and crushed the witch into an ice block. Charlotte fell into the snow with a dull thud. Wounded, she coughed and tried to turn over onto her stomach, but her body did not obey the girl. The knights watched the leader in shock. No one dared to come closer. One of the warriors began to wail in despair, asking what to do now, even if Lady Sierra had lost. Someone's sword landed on the ground with a clang. The knight stepped back, sobbing that he couldn't believe what he saw. He turned sharply and rushed out of the battlefield. They cannot win. The others looked after him with their mouths open. Realizing that there was no point in resisting, the entire company ran away after their comrade. Charlotte, still lying on the cold ground, stretched out her hands, trying to stop her fallen army. When she was able to sit up, she found herself completely alone in the middle of an icy desert. The girl's shoulders were shaking with anger, and somehow, throwing away the fiery sparks, the witch managed to get to her feet. With just her lips, she hissed words of hatred at the cowardly knights. Suddenly, behind her, she heard someone asking her why the witch didn't run away, since there was no chance of winning at all. Charlotte turned around sharply. Who dared to say such a thing? A guy stood in front of her, holding his hands in his trouser pockets and smiling smugly, introducing himself as a man who wanted to earn a few golden coins. Leaning forward slightly, he repeated the question, still smiling. Sierra shook her head, replying that the word escape was never and never would be in her vocabulary. The stranger chuckled, pretending to cover his mouth with his hand. He said that, although it was cute, they didn't have time to chat about it now. The witch had no intention of stopping the argument and defiantly asked what he was talking about, not seeing what was happening behind her back. Finally, she realized she had been distracted and turned around at the sound of flapping wings. At that very moment, the dragon opened its mouth and attacked its opponents with ice magic. Sierra had no choice but to cover her face with her hands helplessly. Now it was all over. But for some reason, after a few seconds, she realized that she was still alive and opened her eyes. Incredibly, the stranger literally held the monster with one hand, while the other remained in his pocket. The guy loudly exclaimed that the dragon was bothering him. A shadow passed over his face, suggesting that he was talking to a miss. The brunette casually threw the ice creature away from himself, because a small creature like this dragon should calm down. Having fallen on his back, the enemy, still rolling on the ground, comically began to wave his paws in the air. He couldn't understand what had happened a minute ago. While being towed, he regained his balance and turned over, clawing at the ground. The dragon seemed to have doubled in size after its absurd defeat, bristling and now looking down at its tiny enemy. The stranger extended his hand, gathering his magic together. He smirked and said that it looked like he had encountered a naughty dragon, while purple magic runes formed on his palm. The red eyes gleamed dangerously. Unfortunately for the dragon, he would soon be burned. It seemed that the monster had never encountered anything like this before, and looked at the guy in bewilderment. Sierra couldn't believe her eyes. A purple vortex emanating from the palm of the skinny stranger was spinning the dragon around like a rag doll. Finally, the raging magical hurricane hid the enemy's enormous figure from view. When the purple haze cleared, a beautiful blue crystal remained in the air. It landed right in the brunette's palm. He threw the stone into the air, turned around and asked the witch if she would go on a date with him at the expense of the life she had saved. The girl dropped to her knees and pressed her left hand to the wound on her right forearm. This impudent fellow was able to kill a disaster category monster with one movement. She felt something ringing in her head and her eyes closing. Charlotte only had time to ask who he was before she fell back unconscious. She was immediately picked up in the arms of a sudden savior. Leaning over the girl, he said with a smile that he was a simple mercenary who decided to earn some gold coins. Yulman, the first among the apostles, nicknamed Limitless. Everything that was happening flashed before my eyes as if through a veil, a purple whirlwind in which the ice dragon met his death. The stranger looked over his shoulder with a caustic grin, tossing a crystal in his palm. Sierra's eyes widened in horror. Sitting up abruptly in bed, she screamed and reached out her hand for the ice dragon. "We must catch and kill it!" But suddenly the realization overwhelmed the girl. Her hands felt not a blanket of snow, but soft blankets. Where was she? The voice of the chief magician of the empire, Guam Asas, the gray-haired director of the Royal Academy, was heard. He looked up from the book he was reading and asked the witch how she was feeling, since she had been sleeping for several days. Sierra clutched the blanket and let out a desperate cry as she asked the principal what had happened to the ice dragon. The old man slammed the book shut, replying that the dragon had been destroyed and that Charlotte herself needed to lie down, rest, and not worry about anything. The lenses of his glasses flashed as the man looked closely at Sierra and asked what happened in the end and how the monster died. Biting her lip, Charlotte frantically tried to remember at least something, but she couldn't do it. Aces chuckled under his breath. So that's how it is. He brought a thing to the girl that looked like a small lamp the size of a finger, in which a purple light was burning, and asked her to take a closer look. Charlotte stared at the flames in shock. The mage said that when he arrived at the battlefield, the fire was next to the witch. Even when Sierra didn't come to her senses, it didn't disappear. Hellfire is a flame that humans can never manipulate unless it is… The witch clenched her teeth angrily and finished the director's speech, if this is not an apostle. The man, fingering the strands of his long beard, said that the apostles had long since disappeared. But since Hellfire had appeared in this battle, it meant that they clearly didn't know something. Aces placed the book on the table before leaving the room. Finally, he told the silently sitting witch that she had tried hard and should rest, so he was leaving so as not to disturb her. The old man, without turning around, said that, in addition, the Empire would claim that it was Charlotte's squad that defeated the Ice Dragon. Then he finally turned around and smiled, comforting the dejected Sierra. After all, everything connected with the apostles would cause a lot of unnecessary panic, so the girl should just accept all the honors and praise. She, clutching the blanket with all her might, whispered to the rest of the room that she would do it. The people gathered at the walls of the academy, enthusiastically greeting Sierra and thanking her for the victory. Meanwhile, in the city tavern, one of the military detachments gathered to have a feast. Yulman sat in the corner of the bar, holding his forehead with his hand. He was worried that there would be a fuss when his identity was revealed. But then it dawned on the guy, he would never see cute girls who would treat him like a hero, because the apostle came to the world of people to find himself a girlfriend. Throwing a bag of things over his shoulder, he got ready to leave, and thought about leaving this city and hiding somewhere. Meanwhile, a detachment of Imperial warriors was heading towards the doors of the tavern. Tears appeared in the brunette's eyes as he said goodbye to his favorite tavern and the beautiful lady behind the bar. The knights approached the doors of the bar, and the leading warrior, a fair-haired man in a red cloak, loudly asked those present which of them was a mercenary. Everyone in the tavern looked around and simultaneously pointed their fingers at Yulman, who was trying to hide. The guy froze. Had he really been exposed? The commander-in-chief loudly reported that Yulman was now invited to take part in the entrance test to the Royal Academy. The warriors began to hum in displeasure. This is the very best academy in the Guam Empire, and this guy only recently came here. Why did they call him? In response to the indignation, the man asked a counter-question. Did everyone present here participate in the battle against the Ice Dragon together with this man? The warriors' faces lengthened. Could it really be about the recent battle against the Ice Dragon? Someone spoke into the silence that only a handful of people survived there, and this guy was one of them. The man in the red cloak pointed at Yulman. Besides all this, the guy was safe and sound in the battle. He asked the warriors if they had any questions, and they fell silent again. Yulman raised his hand sharply. Clenching his fist, he asked as he exhaled if there were many beautiful girls in this academy. The commander-in-chief was at a loss. He clearly did not expect such a question. Meanwhile, the academy was indeed attended by young beauties in short school uniforms that did not hide their thighs in high stockings. The elastic chest rose in time with the girls' breathing. Yes, the Royal Academy of the Guam Empire could boast of its students. As if handpicked, Yulman had found himself in a real paradise. Aces stood on the balcony with the commander-in-chief, who asked the director why he decided to train an incompetent mercenary. The old man, squinting good-naturedly, replied that young people should be given the opportunity to prove themselves. The magician watched the young man spin like a top, looking at the pretty girls, and continued that these people could have unexpected talents. Yulman did not notice anything around him, looking lovingly at the short skirts. Ace's voice thundered through the hall, congratulating those in the building on getting the chance to enter the Royal Academy. And in order to see if they were suitable for the academy, the entrance test would begin right now. The man added that he hoped the candidates would do everything in their power to pass and survive, as various pentagrams painted red began to appear on the floor. Those present began to talk among themselves with concern. What did he mean? How to survive? Suddenly, huge clawed paws began to appear from the magic circles. A furious clicking sound could be heard from all around, and fiery demonic wolves emerged from the runes, summoning beasts that only experienced fire mages could summon. Trembling with fear, the candidates asked each other if this training would kill them. At the end of the hall, Yulman, who had developed a habit of calling all the pretty girls sisters, assured one of them that he would protect her and that there was no reason to worry. The crowd scattered as a pack of firewolves rushed towards them. Some still did nothing, not believing that this was a real monster. The apostle, putting his hands in his pockets, chuckled boredly. Is it really worth making such a fuss over such a small fish? One of the candidates tried to shake off the panic and began to cast a spell. He called on the others to show their best together, creating runes in the air with confident movements. A multitude of dark vines began to sprout from his palms, but they were no match for the wolves, who easily jumped up and playfully avoided the trap. Someone from the crowd released air currents at the enemies, but the fire wolves dealt with this even faster than with the vines. One of the magician's eyes widened. He had never expected such an outcome. What no one could have predicted was that one of the wolves would run up to the guy standing nearby and tear his head off with one jerk, licking his bloody mouth. The pink-haired witch shook in horror as it happened right next to her. The future students scattered when it became clear that this was not an imitation. The fire wolves really decided to kill everyone. There were desperate cries calling for escape. Yulman still seemed not to understand what was happening and awkwardly stood near the wall. Suddenly, someone loudly called the fleeing people fools. The tall, long-haired blonde man in uniform, who had been silent until then, created a shield between himself and the wolves, shouting that in such a situation, a mass exodus was indeed a stupid decision, as people were becoming targets for the enemy. He waved his hands and created magical aerial targets. They tightly enveloped the unsuspecting animals. The stranger then ordered the fleeing candidates to attack the wolves. It worked. The future students divided into their battle groups. Archers attacked with arrows from the left flank. The mages should attack from the right flank. The swordsmen are right in the center. A huge amount of magic and fighting force attacked the entire flock at once. A moment later, the immobilized monsters lay whining in different corners of the hall. The delighted candidates saluted each other and gave high fives. They did it. Loud cries of joy could be heard from everywhere that they had actually managed to win. But, unfortunately, this was not the case. Red fiery figures were approaching the crowd. It wasn't the end, oh no! The flock suddenly merged into one huge bloody fiery dance. The future students raised their heads, watching in horror what was happening. From the flames he appeared. The fiery wolf Cerberus, several heads sticking out of one body, ready to tear apart anyone who came close. The magicians and warriors pointed their swords and wands at the monster. Cerberus watched them, spewed flames, and was made of it himself. The inspired candidates were ready to rush into battle. The blonde noticed that this was indeed a royal academy, since they were using such a dangerous monster for the test. The monster roared and released fiery clots from its body into the crowd. The candidates frantically thought about how to protect themselves from the flying fire. But the force of the attack was so great that it instantly knocked the warriors off their feet. Yulman, who had not moved from the spot since the beginning of the battle, who was watching this, felt one of the clots flying towards him, without even taking his hands out of his pockets. He shrugged his shoulders. Such a weak attack, not even worth paying attention to. But the others made such a noise because of this. Suddenly he saw a shadow above him, of someone else's female breast. Yulman raised his head, blushing deeply. The stranger ran straight at him, pushing him away from the burning attack. Still red as a lobster, the boy looked reverently at the stranger lying on him. White hair tied with a bow and huge eyes of the girl, which examined the rescued. She rose to her knees, telling him to be careful, because he almost got hit. The girl hung over him and asked if everything was okay. Yulman could only open and close his mouth. Another explosion went off, showering the couple with shards of glass and walls. The girl rose to her feet and walked away from Yulman, but turned around and wished him to be more careful next time. The discouraged boy sat on the steps and watched as the fragile stranger approached Cerberus, saying that the rest should be left to her. The apostle blushed again. She was really worried about him. Thoughts of battle faded into the background for him. Pressing his palms to his face, he realized that some feeling was making his heart beat faster. Meanwhile, the blonde girl swung her arm and created an ice boomerang. And the next moment, she threw it at the monster. Ice boomerangs attacked the demonic dog from all sides. Crouching down, the stranger created a large magic circle. Vines began to crawl towards Cerberus, enveloping his powerful paws. The rest of the warriors stood menacingly. Their help should not be forgotten either. The girl asked to distract Cerberus for a while so that she could use a restraining spell. A crowd moved towards the dog from different angles, attacking with swords, arrows, and magic. The enraged Cerberus threw all his heads at his opponents, throwing them aside. Meanwhile, the witch jumped into the vacated space to cast a powerful attack spell from there. The magic circle hung directly above Cerberus's head. The dog raised its head and belched streams of fire in that direction. The girl stretched out her hands and created ice shackles. First, ice crystals stretched out under Cerberus, trapping the dog's paws. Then, From above, collars fell out of the magic circle for each of the monsters' heads. Cerberus found himself trapped in ice, with ice collars around his neck and his paws shackled by ice flows. The surprised candidates opened their mouths. Could she really have done it? Yulman smiled dreamily. The test should be over soon, and he himself would definitely talk to this young lady later. Sierra, standing in the distance, smirked. No, this is not the end. Suddenly, a powerful stream of fire flew right next to the blonde witch's face. She turned around abruptly, not understanding what was happening. Right behind her, Cerberus was burning all the ice magic she had created with hellfire. With the teeth of 3 mouths clicking, he bit through the collars and trampled the ice under his paws. The girl jumped to the side. What kind of flame was this? The blonde man who had attacked Cerberus earlier shouted that some idiot had used fire magic. His hair flew up as the boy created a powerful wind barrier that blocked the flames. The crowd began to buzz. Could he really cope with fire? What amazing wind magic. The air currents picked up the dog and lifted him up. Yulman told himself that the wind could not extinguish the flame, but it could contain it. Had this man really calculated such subtleties? Despite this, after a few seconds, Cerberus was free and ran towards the blonde witch. The girl cowered in fear as a huge shadow loomed over her. A nascent magic flashed in her palm and immediately died out. It had not yet been restored. Yulman came to the forefront. This was his chance to show himself. He suddenly appeared right in front of the witch, grinning triumphantly in advance, and she screamed in surprise. Grabbing the stranger by the shoulder, he pulled her towards him. Turning away from Cerberus, Yulman hugged the witch, whispering that his sweet little sister shouldn't be afraid. The apostle's red eyes glittered with anticipation. He said pompously that this wild dog just needed to be kicked so that it would finally shut up, and he put his left hand forward, clutching the girl in his right. From the powerful magic, Cerberus flew sharply into the opposite wall and landed on it with a crash, destroying the surface. Yulman chuckled. He should be able to charm his little sister with this. He looked down and saw her face turn red and her eyes fill with tears. Without letting go of the witch, he asked worriedly if he had hurt her while kicking that dog. She, without moving, tearfully asked to finally let her go. And only then did Yulman realize what kind of softness and elasticity he had been feeling in his hand for a long time. The blonde witch pressed her fists into his chest and turned her head away, asking him not to touch her. The apostle, blushing, quickly walked away and put his hands forward, apologizing and assuring that he didn't do it on purpose. Both of them, blushing, stood at a distance from each other. The other guys, watching this scene, were indignant. How dare this scoundrel use such a moment to touch the goddess? And when did he even manage to approach her? A clear female voice was heard. At this point, their test was over. The crowd parted, and a beautiful, stately woman appeared before those present. She stood at the ruined steps, her arms folded across her chest. One of the candidates, covered in scratches and with some of his clothes charred, asked in surprise who she was. The stranger sternly introduced herself. Sarah, deputy director. The blonde man who attacked Cerberus with his strong magic asked the woman reproachfully, "What the hell happened here?" And she was surprised by the question. Then the guy pointed his finger at the lifeless body of one of the students. Could a regular test for the Royal Academy really just kill people? Sarah narrowed her eyes and smiled mysteriously. Before the blonde could even blink, the deputy director seemed to use magic to draw out all the destruction, human, and that which had affected the building itself. Moreover, from the way the supposedly dead students gradually disappeared, it became clear that this was just an illusion. The woman waved her long hair and found translucent cards in her hands. She laughed. What did they say about the students? The blonde looked at Sarah in bewilderment. Was this really puppet magic? The warriors were talking among themselves about the rumors that there was a deputy director of the Royal Academy who could control objects using magic. Sarah stepped forward and said that now that everything was settled, she wanted to say a few words. First of all, the vice principal wanted to congratulate the remaining people on passing the test and being accepted into the ace class of the Guam Royal Academy. Yulman perked up his ears when a couple of pretty girls started discussing how Ace's class was being taught by a great wizard, and who would be doing it this year. The boy's eyes lit up. What if it turns out to be his cute little sister? Sarah caught everyone's attention again, announcing the teacher of Ace's class. A shock of red hair flashed before Yulman's eyes. He took a step back in surprise. The vice principal introduced Sierra Charlotte, the new class leader and the person in charge of the students. She sternly glanced at those present with her blue eyes. The blonde witch opened her mouth in admiration. The fire witch herself would teach them. Sarah said that it seemed like everyone had heard of Sierra's teacher reputation, but if there were any other questions, they could ask her directly. Sierra said goodbye to her deputy, who who said she needed to get back to her duties and left the room. The crowd enthusiastically clung to the girl, bombarding her with questions about what they would do now. Yulman, meanwhile, tried in every way to avoid being seen. Sierra, arms folded across her chest, was deadly serious as she explained that the students were free for today, but that tomorrow, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they needed to gather at the training grounds to practice fighting. After a long silence, she added that she hoped that the warriors would get along with each other. And if there were no more questions, those present could disperse. But the long-haired magician was not going to let her go so easily, he called out to Charlotte. She turned around, unhappy that she had been distracted. He shouted that if they got into the ace class because of her strength, then why did that guy get through too? Naturally, he could not help but notice Yulman creeping from the center of the hall, and in his speech he singled him out from the crowd. The apostle forced a smile. Calm down, you need to control yourself. Sierra looked at the guy with confusion and asked what was wrong with him. Yulman was immediately buried under a pile of accusations. The crowd said that he had done nothing, that he was lustful as a wolf, that he pestered his female students every now and then, and that he was simply awful. The blonde witch immediately stood up for him. She said that it was a lie, that he was there to help her, and the rest was just an accident. Some student gasped, "What a kind goddess!" Sierra walked quickly towards the apostle. At first he was horrified inside, but he thought that he had erased her memory that time, which meant the girl shouldn't recognize him. The red-haired witch looked closer, thoughtfully saying that the guy's face seemed familiar to her, and they could have met somewhere, but he waved his hands as if to say that it was impossible, and she had confused him with someone else. Charlotte clearly didn't trust him and asked her question again. Yulman waved it off again. He would certainly remember such a nice girl. He definitely wouldn't forget. The guys from the crowd began to indignantly talk about how this guy dared to hit on the fire witch herself. The teacher shouldn't allow such a person to enter Ace's class. The girl raised her hand, calling them to calm down. She would only place the boy in Ace's class temporarily. She said that the girl he saved explained that the student did nothing wrong. Besides, he was the only one who dared to help her and stood up to Cerberus. This courage is not like that of an ordinary person. Yulman broke into a reverent smile and thanked Teacher Sierra for such a compliment. Charlotte challenged the crowd. If any of them were unhappy with her decision, let them try to convince her otherwise. The silence in the hall meant only one thing: there were no people willing to do this. The fair-haired mage clenched his teeth in anger. Finally, this long day ended and night came. Aces received Sierra and Sarah in his office. He, folding his hands in front of him in a lock, asked if all those who felt in the battle against the ice dragon got into Ace's class. Charlotte replied that it was true. She leaned forward anxiously and asked if it was possible that the apostle would also be among these disciples. The director leaned back in his chair and asked how the entrance test went. Sarah revealed that there was a student on the test who was capable of standing up to Cerberus. She frowned and continued to talk about how they didn't see the moment he was right in front of the dog, because the next second Cerberus flew so far away as if his body was out of control. The old man thought for a moment and replied, "If the monster flew away, then perhaps the student used talent magic. Spells that ordinary magicians cannot use, only a few, and very capable ones. Talent magic is the rarest type of magic." Sierra convinced herself that maybe this was true. Aces looked at the large grandfather clock opposite and advised the girls not to think too much about the apostle, as it was already quite late, and sent them off to rest. The witches bowed and prepared to leave, wishing the director a good night and a good rest. A few seconds later, the door slammed behind them. The old man muttered something into his beard. He reached into his desk drawer and grabbed the beautiful carved handle. In the box, there was a lamp with a purple, hellish flame blazing in it. Taking the jar in his hand, the director stared at the light, and his loud sigh echoed throughout the office. Yulman, dressed in an academy uniform, walked sadly around the yard, complaining about having to get up so early. He yawned sweetly. He really wanted to sleep, but the dream immediately disappeared as soon as he noticed the blonde crown of the witch he had saved. Sparks danced in her eyes. This was yesterday's little sister. It was high time to talk to the stranger. He ran towards her, shouting greetings as he went. He suddenly turned deeply red and ran closer. The witch's chest swayed as soon as she turned around. The guy almost fainted from this sight. He was in heaven. The girl, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, asked in a gentle voice what he wanted. Yulman's cheeks turned red, and he awkwardly recalled yesterday's incident during the test. The witch also blushed deeply. She denied it and assured him that everyone had misunderstood everything and that she should thank her savior. The student giggled and asked his name, introducing herself as Aisha. Yulman began feverishly thinking about how to avoid pronouncing his real name. He replied that his name was Lu, just his first name, no last name. Aisha noted that the name suited him. The apostle awkwardly scratched the back of his head and suggested that they go to class together. A long-haired blonde man watched them from afar. He growled quietly, still unhappy with the presence of the impudent guy. Finally, the students gathered in the large hall, and Sierra, standing in front of them, suggested that the lesson begin. She put her hands on her hips, cast magic runes on the floor, and announced that today the students would fight each other, and their opponent would be... But Charlotte didn't manage to finish speaking because a huge fire tiger jumped out onto the crowd right from the circle. The student, clearly one of the smartest in the class, noted that the Yang tiger, although a normal fire-type summon beast, had great firepower. The long-haired mage mockingly said that they would be dealing with only the Yang tiger. Was it really fair to the tiger itself? Charlotte immediately retorted. She didn't say that there would be only one animal. There will be a lottery whereby students will be divided into pairs, with 2 people with the same number forming a group. While she was saying that they would have to defeat the tiger within an hour, more and more huge saber-toothed cats appeared behind her. Yulman unfolded the sheet. There was number 7. Aisha got the first number. The guy whined that fate was not at all kind to him. Meanwhile, someone approached the witch, and she turned around at the sound of footsteps. The long-haired mage bowed respectfully to her and introduced himself, saying that he was very lucky to have the opportunity to team up with such a beautiful miss. His name was Kyle, and the boy was the eldest son of the Smith family. But the witch seemed unimpressed by Kyle's attempts to charm her, and worriedly suggested that they first discuss battle strategy, since they had little time left. The magician waved his hand at those present, and confidently replied that, compared to the others, he believed that one person would be enough to defeat the Yang tiger, so let the girl let him figure it out. Aisha wanted to say something but didn't have time. Kyle had already started walking towards the tigers, saying at the end that it wouldn't take long. He thought with a cheeky smile that with the strength of his family, he would deal with the tiger, and then this girl would take care of him. The magician stopped a few meters from the fire tiger. He held his hand out in front of him, conjuring something, saying that the animal looked very cute. The wind blade spell swept through the hall like a whirlwind, heading towards the monster. Sierra, who was watching this, thought that Kyle's talent magic was a broken limiter. It could increase the outgoing magic attack by 1 level. Now, with the increase effect, his attack level had increased to intermediate, or even advanced, talent magic. Ian made a furrow in the stone floor with his claws, flying back a couple of meters. The wildcat's yellow eyes narrowed with rage. He roared and released a burst of fire from his mouth. Kyle clenched his palms and called him a pathetic insect as he cast another spell. He threw a new stream of air straight at the tiger, which again doused everything with fire. A wave of fire passed right past the crowd. The wind lifted the girls' skirts and they began to cover them with their hands, squealing. The boys coughed from the dust and flashes of fire. Kyle smiled smugly, saying that as he said, he managed to quickly deal with the monster. He walked slowly towards Aisha, telling her how easy the training was, but she looked behind him in horror. The girl screamed, warning the magician of the danger. Kyle looked around sharply, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly, a completely alive and even more angry tiger, Yang, pounced on him. The magician looked at the approaching monster with confusion. The guy continued to awkwardly shift around in place. It seems he only woke up when he saw a monster flying towards him with outstretched paws. Tiger Yang knocked him to the ground. Looming over Kyle, the animal released a deadly stream of fire from its mouth. A student from the crowd turned to Sierra with concern. The tiger would destroy the magician on the spot. But she didn't even react, but continued to watch the fight with her brows furrowed. The entire hall was filled with raging fire, and for a moment the silhouettes of the fighters disappeared from sight. Suddenly the tiger recoiled in shock, and then he flew back, thrown back by the flow of air. Kyle, who only had damage to his clothes, stood with a victorious smile, his hands in his pockets. He was not going to die here. The guy approached Aisha, asking her opinion, because their team should be the first to complete this task. Charlotte approached the couple and called them. She congratulated the winners and allowed them to rest, as they were the second to complete the task. Kyle was incredibly surprised, as was the witch behind him. He immediately shouted that it was impossible, no one could do it faster than him, and that there was some kind of mistake. The teacher pointed somewhere to the side, and that's where the team that finished first was located. They had already completed the task and were one step ahead of Aisha and Kyle, the latter of whom kept repeating that it was impossible. When the enthusiastic crowd parted, they saw an incredible picture. The fire tiger, like a house cat, lay on its back, wriggling comically, and Lu and her partner stroked its belly and called it a cutie. This is what happened 15 minutes ago. Still frustrated, Yulman lamented the impossibility of being paired with Aisha. Suddenly, someone came up to him and called out. He turned around, asking who was speaking to him. A warlike-looking student stood in front of him, holding an axe in her hands as if it weighed nothing, and boldly said that they were now in the same group and the guy could call her Arya. But Yulman did not pay attention to her, and continued to sigh languidly for Aisha. This made the girl quite angry, and the other students now laughed at the couple. Hissing in annoyance, Arya swung her weapon with all her might and lunged straight at Lu to get his attention. But he seemed not to notice anything around him. Finally, he sighed heavily. Then he stopped the axe flying towards him with 2 fingers. Still looking at the piece of paper, the apostle assured that he had heard everything. Arya's face darkened. This guy? She easily threw the weapon over her back and mockingly said that she heard that Lu was a real pervert, causing him to cry out in indignation. Turning around, the girl threw out one last word that she alone would cope with the Tiger Yang, and that her partner should not cause problems. He watched thoughtfully as Arya, weapon in hand, walked towards the tiger. Could she really handle it alone? The student jumped straight at the animal with a scream. Then she brought the axe down with a crash, but not entirely successfully. Tiger Yang jumped to the side. He roared, opening his fanged mouth. A shadow fell across the girl's face, and her eyebrows drew together at the bridge of her nose. She shifted her weight to her right leg, holding the base of the axe firmly in her hands. Then she suddenly lunged with her foot straight at the tiger's face. But with this, Arya trapped herself. A fiery vine, a tiger's tail, closed around her ankle. A few seconds later, the animal threw the student far back with its tail. Her axe spun through the air several times like a boomerang, and a little later it landed with a crash, hitting the marble floor, making a hole there. Arya huddled up and found herself on her knees, the weapon falling right next to her. The next moment, the tiger picked up speed and pounced from above straight at the girl. The student weakened, clenched her teeth in helplessness. She grabbed the base of the axe tightly and pointed it at the tiger. The animal sank its teeth into the wooden base. His teeth were dangerously close to Arya's hand. The girl closed her eyes tightly, surrendering to chance. If only she were a little stronger. At the moment when the Tiger Yang had already begun to pounce on the student, Yulman's voice was heard, addressing the wild cat, asking why she was cruel to his little sister. The boy's eyes gleamed dangerously, and he muttered something about a little kitten, as if he was out of his mind. Suddenly, the tiger loosened his grip and even seemed somehow taken aback. As usual, Yulman, with his hands in his pockets, rocked on his toes and said that the matter with the tiger was decided. Arya opened one eye and stared at him in bewilderment. And then she immediately discovered that opposite her was no longer a fierce, fire-breathing tiger, but an affectionate and playful cat. She pointed her finger at the surprised monster in shock and hysterically asked what had happened to it. Sierra, who was standing nearby, noted that the hardest way to defeat a monster was to tame it. Aisha clapped her hands and exclaimed in delight that this was the first time she had seen a person do something like this. Kyle's eyes narrowed, thinking this was some kind of nonsense. He was seriously angry. Not only had he fought, but these two were just lucky enough to encounter a harmless animal. Meanwhile, Yulman and Arya were squatting next to the tame tiger and scratching its belly. The long-haired mage walked up to Lu and said loudly that he really envied him. Arya looked up at the guy. He asked with a wry smile why Lu was so lucky, since he had met a harmless tiger. The apostle's partner stood up abruptly, attacking Kyle with accusations. At this time, the other students also began to be indignant, saying that Kyle was right. Their team had come across a very angry tiger. Some were even wounded during the battle. Yulman smiled and said that it was all because of his magic, in magic called taming the beast. Hearing this, Charlotte's eyes widened as she stared at the guy. Kyle rolled his eyes. He had never heard of such talent magic. Could Lu demonstrate it to everyone to prove his point? The apostle grinned in response to this. The tiger, lying on its back, immediately stood up. All the tigers that took part in the test began to circle around Yulman. The crowd buzzed. "What's going on with these fire cats?" The apostle did not answer but only looked away. As if on command, the entire pride lay down on the floor and bent over in something like a bow before Yulman. He, smiling from ear to ear, quoted the proverb, "If you don't see it, you won't believe it. But if you haven't seen it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Hearing this, Kayla was overcome with anger from defeat and not understanding what was happening. Aisha seemed speechless at what she saw. Arya could only open and close her mouth, silently watching what was happening. This pervert was hiding such power. The crowd was silent too. The students just stared at Yulman with wide eyes. Sierra interrupted this scene. She had had enough. She created a magical circle of fire in the air. The test was over for today and all the tigers disappeared into the swirl of the magic circle. The teacher walked up to Lu and sternly asked when he would register his talent magic. The guy scratched his cheek and replied that no one asked him to do this. Charlotte bowed and apologized to the students, as she urgently needed to visit the academic affairs office and bring in some new information. The girl let the students go and went to the exit, while the apostle thought that, fortunately for him, in one of the human novels that he had read, there was talent magic, taming, which meant that Sierra should not suspect anything. The sun illuminated the inner courtyards of the academy. Arya, Yulman, and Aisha were walking along the alley. Arya slapped the guy hard on the shoulder and exclaimed that she didn't expect such strength from such a pervert, and that he was a good guy. The apostle was indignant at this and asked not to call him that because he had a name, Lu. Aisha chuckled softly as she listened to their bickering. The fun was interrupted by Kyle appearing in front of them. He dryly addressed Yulman, that now he understood what kind of talent magic it was, and it was not surprising that Cerberus from the entrance test did not attack him. The other disciples, hearing this, looked at each other. It really seemed like the truth. The apostle sighed. Well, here it goes again. The warriors continued to talk. Someone said that with the ability to control the summoned beast, the guy could have directed Cerberus to attack the others. He was told that Lu could have done it deliberately in order to have the opportunity to touch the goddess. The apostle was amazed at how developed the human imagination could be. Arya spoke up in his defense, loudly saying that this couldn't have happened, because if Cerberus had been set on the students, would they have been able to pass? This made sense. The warriors did not know what to answer. Aisha couldn't stand the injustice, and said that talent magic requires great ability and long training. Besides, the wind barrier that time was unlikely to resist Cerberus, and Lu saved her, and the girl feels only gratitude. She expressed the hope that the students will not make erroneous assumptions. Kyle growled at Aisha's words. She said that the wind barrier wouldn't be able to stand. What impudence! The guy's fists involuntarily clenched, ready to pounce on the enemy, whom they were also protecting. He couldn't believe that the student was lying to help that freak. Yulman sincerely thanked the blushing Aisha, to which Arya jealously reminded him of herself. There was silence in the director's office, interrupted only by the ticking of the large grandfather clock. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door and the director allowed them to enter. Sierra literally flew into the room saying that she had found him, a man with the magic talent of taming. Aces sat up straight in his chair in surprise, his fingers clasped together tense. The man asked how strong the beasts were that this student could control. Charlotte thought for a moment and replied, "It's not clear yet. It seems like he can instantly tame a beast like Cerberus." Aces ordered the teacher to find out as quickly as possible. The trio of new friends strolled lazily around the building. Arya stretched sweetly, regretting that the time for rest ended so quickly. Aisha, studying the scroll in her hand, remarked that if she was not mistaken, the class would be studying history today. When Lu asked again, she replied that she had heard that it was a subject that looked deeply into many major historical events. Yulman's eyebrows drew together, and he hoped that they wouldn't talk about the cities he had bombed. Suddenly, Arya saw Sierra and greeted her. Aisha and Yulman exchanged glances. The guy was dejected. He had a bad feeling. Charlotte immediately, without any ceremony, called the student to the court tower. The inside of the court tower was decorated with statues of 4 beautiful maidens on columns located around the arena, with signs inscribed on it. Sierra and Lu found themselves right in the center of the arena. The area was also illuminated by 4 multicolored magic balls on high stands. Yulman smiled awkwardly, wondering why Miss Sierra brought him to this place. The girl replied that she wanted to ask the student a question. Suddenly, a circle of fire formed around the arena, and the teacher herself rose into the air and, warningly, said her name, then said that she would ask her question only once. Would Lu become the Fire Witch's apprentice? The guy was taken aback. It was very sudden. Sierra smiled triumphantly in advance. She was sure that no one would refuse to be a student of the great imperial magician. But her expectations were not met. Yulman crossed his arms in front of himself, apologized, and refused. At first, the Fire Witch did not understand what exactly the guy answered. She smiled and asked to wait a little. But then the realization dawned on her mind. Sierra screamed, pointing her finger at Lu, who stood calmly. She was beside herself and yelled at Yulman, unable to believe that he dared to refuse. The guy rolled his eyes once again. Yes, he is only here to find himself a wife, and he is not going to become someone's apprentice and work hard. Suddenly his eyes sparkled. Lou thought out loud that there was no rule that prohibited a student and teacher from getting married. But Charlotte did not support this idea, warning the student not to even think about it. The apostle sighed in disappointment. What a pity. He turned around and waved his hand, asking Sierra to forget about it. The witch clenched her teeth in irritation. She asked ironically how Lou planned to find a wife given his status. The girl suggested that he remember how the guy lived before he got to this academy. Yulman lowered his head and indulged in memories of the time when he first came to the world of people. Huge price tags, bigger than the records of the apostles. He walked past the shop windows and was horrified by the prices of ordinary cakes, a large commission that took most of his coins. He vividly imagined Aisha running away from him because he was too poor, and therefore they could not be together. Yulman raised his head to the ceiling and screamed in horror that this would never happen. Sierra smiled contentedly. She had finally managed to appeal to the student's voice of reason. She raised her finger and offered a deal. If Lou became her apprentice, he would gain status and access to her property. She rose up again, and fire began to blaze around her, and fiery flashes also burst from her hands. The witch asked her question again. Is Lou ready to become Sierra Charlotte's apprentice? Without turning around, the apostle's voice was heard, asking Miss Sierra if she really thought she could convince him just by that. He turned around and smiled slyly. And at that very moment, like a child, he ran to the teacher with a squeal. He agreed to become Master Sierra's student. The witch was loudly indignant when she realized that Lou had simply jumped and grabbed her leg. The next moment, they both fell to the floor, Yulman tightly hugging his teacher's hips with both hands. The guy also demanded a reward from the master. At the same moment, various magical symbols and constellations began to appear on the ceiling, shimmering in blue. An immobilized Sierra said that the student might not bow to her and he should have let go of her already. A completely happy Yulman, without letting go of Sierra, asked what was wrong with the student holding the master's hips. Suddenly, fiery flashes began to burst out all around the perimeter of the circle in which they lay. The apostle looked around in surprise, not understanding what was happening. The flashes grew larger and larger, and now they were jumping around the entire hall like sunbeams. Sierra hissed that Lou was an idiot. Finally, a dome of fire covered them both, and one of the statues on the column said in a muffled voice that the contract was concluded. Yulman felt his forehead heat up as a mark appeared there, looking like a small fire dragon. He slapped his palm. Something strange had happened to his forehead. Sierra, freed from the embrace, was beside herself with rage. She grabbed the apprentice by the scruff of the neck and started shouting that when a contract between a master and an apprentice is made, the contract mark appears at the place where they touch. The boy, embarrassed, quietly noted that Charlotte had not warned him. The witch, realizing that nothing could be changed, sighed and let go of the wayward student. Wearily putting her hand to her face, she said that, in any case, this mark does not appear just like that. Yulman, hearing this, jumped up and down with delight, asking if this meant that Sierra's mark was on her thigh, but the girl ordered him to get lost. A day later in the academic canteen, two students from Sierra's class were talking among themselves, discussing Lou's invitation to the courthouse tower yesterday, and how it seemed he hadn't returned from there yet. Arya and Aisha couldn't get enough food, and the girls sadly thought about the fate of their friend. Arya cried out belligerently that in the court tower, the Royal Academy judges and punishes students. Aisha clutched the hem of her dress, nervously protesting that the boy had done nothing wrong. Kyle came up to them and joined the conversation, laughing when he heard what the girls were talking about. He smiled evilly and said that Lou must have lied about his taming talent magic, and it was discovered, and now the lower classes were worried about each other. Raising an eyebrow, he added that he must have been expelled yesterday after all, scum is scum. Arya jumped up from the table and loudly, screaming, asked him what the hell he was talking about. Aisha tried to calm her classmate down, but she failed. Kyle couldn't stop himself from throwing mud at the student, calling them, like Lou, scum. The blonde witch tried to defend the apostle. She objected to Kyle that he himself saw the magic of Lou's talent with his own eyes, and he would do well to watch his words. At that moment, Yulman's voice was heard. He asked if everyone was talking about him. Kyle narrowed his eyes and looked carefully at the guy who entered. The apostle, as always, was unperturbed and kept his hands in his pockets. He said that he had only been gone one night, and they had already missed them. While he pressed his back against the wall and languidly put his palm to his forehead, the guy had an impressive bag of money hanging on his belt. Aisha jumped up from the table and rushed towards Lou. He clapped his hands. His little sister, as always, remained a cutie. Arya put her hands on her hips and said reproachfully that Lou was still just as lustful. The guy repelled the attack with a smile, calling his partner just as cruel and active. Arya folded her arms across her chest and feigned indifference as she asked Lou to tell her why teacher Sierra had taken him away yesterday. Kyle, who no one had asked, butted in again, mockingly asking what the student and teacher were doing there.
He assumed that Lou had been expelled from the academy.
Aisha sobbed. This is not true. The apostle raised an eyebrow and looked at the offender. Then he raised his head high and said that Master Sierra had made a contract with him. In the dining room, where most of the students were tensely following the conversation, silence reigned. All eyes were glued to Lou. A contract between a master and a student? The apostle summoned magical streams of fire, and that very mark appeared on his forehead. It would prove to everyone that the guy was not lying. Kyle, pretending not to be impressed, said that even if his classmate had beast-taming magic, he was just lucky that there were beasts on the test. Because if it were different, would he have gotten into Ace's class? The guy bared his teeth and challenged Lou to a fight with him. Kyle Smith. Aisha couldn't remain silent when her savior was insulted, so she clenched her fists and replied that even if that was the case, Lou had talent magic, enough to enter the Ace class. The apostle looked admiringly at the girl who defended him so zealously. The long-haired mage abruptly moved his palm, causing a magical flow of air. He, like a knife, rushed towards Aisha and cut off several strands of her hair. Lou and Arya immediately huddled together and ran up to their friend. Kyle shook his hand and sharply told the offended witch not to butt into someone else's conversation unless she was asked to. Arya ran up to Aisha, excitedly asking if she was okay. The girl nodded timidly. The apostle moved closer to Kyle to talk. He agreed to fight the magician. Then a spark flashed in his red eyes as he asked Mr. Kyle in all seriousness to be gentle with him. The wind currents created by Kyle gradually dissipated. He and Lou now stood opposite each other, each gazing at the other. Yulman folded his arms across his chest and asked what the rules and conditions of their duel would be. Smith replied that he would release the maximum of his energy and strike. If Lou held out, it would mean victory, and if he lost, he would immediately leave Ace's class. Arya clenched her fist. How mean this magician is. There isn't a single monster there now. It's not fair at all towards Lou. Aisha, frightened, said nothing, only looked pitifully at Lou. Yulman was not at all scared, he said, with a smile that Mr. Kyle looked confident. He laughed mockingly right in his classmate's face. At first, he continued to stand motionless. Then air magic runes formed in the air. From the small whirlwind that appeared, the magician pulled out a superbly constructed sword. The apostle raised his eyebrows in surprise. Aisha, who had retreated to a safe distance, stood at the stands. But upon seeing the appearance of the weapon, she jumped up and shouted that this could not be. Arya, who was standing behind her, asked what was the matter. The witch, looking somewhere into the distance, told a legend. One day, the ancestor of the Bale family received a gift from the king of the elements, countless amounts of gold and silver that did not fit into the carved chests. And one of the rarest treasures is the magic sword. Aisha wondered if she remembered the name of the weapon for sure. It was he, that same famous and unattainable Excalibur. Yulman smiled slyly, saying that Kyle had an interesting sword. He bit his index finger and set new conditions. If he lost, he would not only leave the class but also leave the academy. Holding Excalibur in front of him, the blonde brazenly replied that Lou had finally realized that he didn't belong here. Yulman ignored the attack but offered to take Kyle's sword if he won. The magician tensed up when he heard such a proposal, not that he was unsure of himself. At the podium, Arya, in her usual manner, screamed, calling Lou a pervert and wishing him to deal with Kyle. The apostle smiled and mockingly asked Kyle if he thought he could lose. The offended blonde clicked his teeth and accepted the conditions. He told his opponent not to blame him for the lack of beasts that could help block Excalibur. Kyle, twirling the sword in his hand, urged Lou not to ask for mercy. Smith, moving the sword in front of him, began to cast spells in an ancient language. Yulman, who stood calmly in the same place, watched this and noticed that the weapon was releasing magical energy quite well. The girls caught their breath at the tension in the air. Kyle swung with all his might, and he rushed at the apostle with his sword at the ready, using the air sentence spell. Yulman only smirked at this attack. He lazily extended his left hand and held it out in front of Kyle. In a matter of seconds, the apostle created a fiery shield, which the unsuspecting Kyle struck with all his might with his sword. The magician exhaled in amazement, and the air currents from his magic covered Aisha and Arya with their heads. The air cloud completely hid the battlefield, and the fighting students? The girls leaned forward, trying to see at least something. Who would win? Kyle stared ahead, unseeing. How could this bastard do it? The apostle, hiding his eyes under his bangs, said that they should not waste time. Smith stared at his opponent in shock. Lu, meanwhile, was already holding the sword in his hands, carefully stroking the blade, saying that he would accept Excalibur. He continued mockingly, thanking Mr. Kyle for his generosity and gift, while Kyle stood in front of him and clenched and unclenched his fists furiously. Arya and Alicia, jumping up and down with anticipation, loudly asked Lu if he was okay. Yulman turned his head to Kyle, reminding him of the attack on Aisha, and expressed hope that this would not happen again. At this, his red eyes lit up with a dangerous fire. The blonde still seemed unable to accept his defeat and looked at Lu with wide eyes. Yulman, seeing his enemy approaching him again, sharply extended his right hand, not letting go of Excalibur in his left. A powerful blast of fire hit Kyle's chest, sending him flying backwards. The guy spat blood out of his mouth. Such was the power of the enemy's spell. Smith flew quite a distance, and eventually, with a deafening roar, it hit the opposite wall, partially destroying it. Aisha and Arya's mouths dropped open in shock. Kyle lay there defeated, spitting out more and more blood. Yulman lowered his hand and smiled. Well, that's all. The clouds of dust cleared and everyone was left with a bloody Kyle lying on the floor. He rose to all fours, spitting out blood again. The magician raised his head, and a veil of rage clouded his eyes. This was impossible. Yulman smiled contentedly as he looked at Excalibur and said that he was taking it. Smith's furious look answered him. At that moment, Lu was called out. He turned around and saw Arya and Aisha running. Arya couldn't believe her eyes. She excitedly asked if Lu was really taking Excalibur. Aisha, smiling sweetly, praised her classmate, saying that he turned out to be stronger than she thought. He blushed and replied that he was indeed very strong. Arya had another brilliant idea and raised her index finger. The girls suggested throwing a party in honor of Lu's victory, since they had no more classes that day anyway. Yulman's eyes sparkled. He imagined an incredible amount of varied food, and was already anticipating how he would try it. The trio turned to leave, shouting victory slogans as they went. A thin stream of blood flowed down Klein's chin, and he thought with horror what would happen to him if his father found out about the loss of Excalibur. Then he took a deep breath and, shouting with all his might, ordered his disciples to stop. Yulman stopped and turned around. Wiping his chin with the back of his hand, the fair-haired mage told the apostle that he could not give the sword to him. Aisha spoke up, reminding him that this was the condition Smith had agreed to, and she hoped the boy would be able to keep his word. Klein, annoyed, shouted that Lu had definitely cheated somehow, and just to be fair, the sword had to be returned. Yulman firmly replied that he refused. Smith was amazed at such audacity. He immediately began to create magical air currents, thereby announcing the battle. A large ball formed in the magician's hands, a concentration of his powers and a powerful weapon. The guy shouted to Lu, "Let him not think that he would leave this site intact." The Trinity found themselves right in the middle of a raging windstorm. Arya said loudly through the noise of the wind that Cain would definitely not allow himself to lose the sword, but a counterattack was already levitating in Yulman's palm. Magical fiery clots? He, smiling, assured that Smith would not succeed. The apostle gripped the hilt of the sword tighter with his other hand. He glanced down and felt some kind of energy coming from outside. Kyle created a vortex of air around himself again and told Lu that he would spare him if he obediently returned the sword to him. He raised an eyebrow and asked what would happen if he refused. Then Smith roared that the student would die right there on the spot. He was so angered by Lu's arrogance that he created one of his most powerful spells, the Wind Whirlwind Blade. The apostle watched the brewing storm with an unreadable expression on his face. The girls prepared to protect themselves from the wind with their hands. But suddenly, Kyle's magic connected with something previously unknown to the present. The space around was filled with a bright green color. Kyle screamed in shock, asking what was happening. Excalibur, which now rose above the warring parties, shone brighter than the sun. The tip of the handle with the precious stone shimmered and began to pulsate. Yulman stood closest to the source of light and looked at it unblinkingly. Aisha covered her eyes with her palms, unable to bear the glow. The apostle chuckled in surprise when he saw what was happening. In place of the sword, a cocoon formed, which rotated at great speed. The outline of a man could be discerned in it, sitting inside in a fetal position. After a few moments, the cocoon dissipated and a girl with green hair appeared before those present. Her clothes were in the same colors and details as Excalibur earlier. The stranger landed softly on the floor. Bending one knee, she lowered her head before Yulman and introduced herself. The girl was the embodiment of the sword of the elemental king named Sylph, and she was greeting her new master. Arya leaned forward, surprised, asking her again what sword she was talking about. Aisha's mouth opened in mute surprise, Kyle also can't utter a word from what he saw. The sylph flew closer to the apostle. He thoughtfully propped his chin on his index finger and asked if the girl was the spirit of this magic sword. She nodded and replied that, according to her agreement with Kyle, now she, the sword of the king of the elements, would belong to Lu. Sylph also asked if she could find out about her master's wishes. Arya noticed that the sword had a spirit. No wonder it was considered a precious treasure. Yulman scratched the back of his head and first asked Sylph to stand up. She obediently obeyed. Kyle was now beside himself with rage. The magician jumped up and ran to the spirit, saying that he was her master. The girl turned around when she heard these words. The magician continued, waving his arms, shouting that he definitely wouldn't have lost to that guy if she had shown up earlier. And he ordered Sylph to return to him immediately. Arya put her hands on her hips and said in disappointment that Kyle was really so shameless as to say such a thing. Aisha was silent and only nodded at her friend's words. Yulman turned to the spirit, deciding that it would be better if she weighed everything herself, and asked if the girl wanted to return.